Welcome to Rooted Realities, where honest talk meets soulful insight. This podcast will guide you through life's ups and downs, offering clarity, courage, and a gentle reminder to give yourself grace. I'm your host, Christmas Miller, holistic health practitioner, life coach, and spiritual mentor. With each episode, I'll blend ancient wisdom with modern insight to inspire you to stay accountable and empowered. So if you're ready to grow from the inside out, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Christmas here, and thank you for tuning in. Today's conversation is about something that sounds contradictory, but it happens more often than we realize. I'm talking about positivity and what happens when it turns toxic. Now, you might be wondering how something meant to help us cope, stay hopeful, stay optimistic, or move forward could actually start working against us. But it does, and it usually happens quietly, even though the impact can be huge. Picture this. You're in the middle of a real, raw emotion. It might be frustration, sadness, or overwhelm. But before you even finish feeling it, you think, I shouldn't feel this way. Let me calm down. Or let me not make this a thing. So you shut it down. Or you try to. Not because your feelings aren't true, but because you don't want to be seen as negative, difficult, or heavy. Or maybe you just don't want to experience those feelings at all. But somewhere along the way, you learned that being the steady one meant staying composed. That holding it together for everyone else meant putting your own reactions on pause. That your frustration, your anger, your grief could wait because someone else was already barely hanging on. So you swallow it. You soften your words. You tell yourself it's not that bad. You stay quiet in spaces that talk about love and healing, even when something in your body says, this ain't right. This ain't right. And instead of trusting that signal, you override it because you don't want to add more negativity to the situation. And those, my friends, are examples of toxic positivity. And this doesn't just happen in one sector of your life. It's an equal opportunity experience, believe it. And it can show up anywhere and impact everything you do. It shows up at work, where you learn real quick which emotions are acceptable and which ones need to stay invisible, especially if you want to be taken seriously. It shows up in families and social circles where you become the stable one, the reasonable one, the one who keeps the boat from rocking because everybody already knows you can handle it. It shows up online too, especially on social media. And believe it or not, even the spaces that are built around positivity take that toxic turn more often than you know. There are a lot of people out here doing good things. I mean, genuinely good, hopeful things. But sometimes that optimism comes from an unspoken pressure to deny what's going on inside of you. And that something actually needs your attention, not a deflective posture. And here's where it turns toxic. People start packaging their pain into something more palatable, or they stop sharing it altogether. When this kind of self-editing becomes normal, it doesn't just shape how we show up publicly. It reshapes how safe we feel about being honest at all. And guess what happens next? Over time, you stop checking in with what you actually feel for the sake of positivity. You start monitoring how it might land. You don't ask, is this true for me? You ask, Is this acceptable here? And that constant self-editing, it has a cost. It disconnects you from your own signals. It blurs the line between emotional regulation and emotional suppression. And eventually, it becomes harder to tell the difference. So you try to stay upbeat while you mask what's really happening. And that right there eventually becomes toxic too. Addressing it, that's the first step toward handling it in a healthy way. Now, this next part is where it gets especially confusing. So I want you to stay with me, because in spiritual and healing spaces, positivity is often framed as progress. And in some cases, it genuinely is. But calm is often treated like proof of growth, and that ain't always the case. And your distress, that can quietly get labeled as resistance, ego, or a lack of faith. And that happens more than people want to admit. So instead of being curious about what you're feeling, you start correcting it. You question your reactions, override your intuition, and not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't fit the tone of the space you're in or the rules you've been taught to follow. And when honesty feels like it might disrupt the harmony, people learn to call their silence maturity. They call their suppression peace. Oh, yes. And they even convince themselves that this is what healing is supposed to look like. But in truth, healing varies from person to person. It's similar sometimes, sure, but exactly the same, highly unlikely. And that is also what toxic positivity looks like. The version that dismisses, minimizes, or overrides real emotional experiences. And that kind of subtlety teaches people which feelings are acceptable and which ones should be corrected, reframed, or kept to themselves. So as we can see, toxic positivity, it isn't loud. It doesn't usually look cruel, and most of the time, it sounds supportive, even encouraging. But underneath it carries that message that difficult emotions are a problem to fix, rather than information to listen to. And here's the difference that often goes overlooked. Healthy emotional regulation doesn't ask you to bypass what you're feeling. I'll repeat that. Healthy emotional regulation does not ask you to bypass, ignore, overlook what you're feeling. It helps you stay with it without being consumed by it. That's the difference. It makes room for anger without letting it run the show. And it allows grief without rushing it toward any type of resolution. Most importantly, it lets your distress exist long enough to tell you something useful. But toxic positivity, it does the opposite. It pressures you to move past those feelings before you've actually met them. It treats discomfort like a failure of mindset. It turns emotional honesty into something that needs to be softened, reframed, or spiritually corrected. In short, one supports integration and the other demands performance. And over time, that difference matters more than you will ever realize. So let's talk about the internal cost, because there is always one with anything toxic. When performance becomes the pattern, the cost isn't always obvious at first. You don't necessarily fall apart. You don't suddenly feel worse. In fact, you might look like you're doing just fine, but slowly you lose access to your own internal feedback. You start second-guessing your reactions. You hesitate before trusting what your body is telling you, and you feel tension, but instead of listening to that, you manage or excuse it away. And this creates a quiet disconnect not from other people, but from yourself. And that's where the real damage happens. Because when you stop trusting your emotional signals, it becomes harder to set boundaries, harder to recognize when something isn't right, and harder to tell the difference between resilience and endurance. Healthy positivity does the opposite because it allows space for frustration without shame. There is no shame here. It makes room for grief. You don't have to rush it. And guess what else it does? It supports hope without you having to behave in a way you don't truly feel. You can be grounded and still be angry. That's okay. You're human. And you can be spiritually connected and still feel restlessness. That's normal too. You can be supportive without disappearing inside of yourself. And that's vital. Because real healing doesn't ask you to feel better all the time. It asks you to feel honesty and honor it. And from that place, clarity will definitely return. Trust also returns, and aligned choice becomes possible again. I want you to remember, toxic positivity isn't about being hopeful. It's about being pressured to feel better before you've been honest about what you feel. But real positivity, that's where the real magic happens. It begins with honoring your feelings so hope can grow from what's real and what's true. Thank you for listening to Rooted Realities. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. It really helps others find the show. Your support is greatly appreciated. Follow me on Instagram and Facebook for more updates and new content. Until next time, stay rooted and keep growing.